thanks to the Gawler History team for allowing me to do this presentation. Paul pointed out my background is in computer games. But one thing I want to make clear is this game is not a computer game. This is a board game. That's intentional. Computer games only have a shelf life of 2 or 3 years. Hopefully people will be able to play this in years to come. So this is a bit of an experiment here. Usually, this talk I'm going to give to you now is basically what I tell people while explaining the scenarios of the game. And usually they have in front of them this map, which is the board for the board game. So everything I'm going to talk about today basically is about various locations on this board. So I don't have a PowerPoint slide because we need to look at that board and zoom into it. So I'm going to try something a little different.
Make sure you remember your password.
No,
Just saying.
Can't get in behind the computer. All right. So here is that board up behind me.
Oh, microphone, Russell.
Testing, 2, 2, 2. Hello. Okay, so behind me you see the projection of that board. As I talk, I'm hoping to be able to zoom into the map. So you can't really see things very clearly from all the way back here, but when we want to zoom into ANZAC Cove, I should be able to say there's ANZAC Cove, and so you know what I'm talking about. With any luck, I may even be able to draw bits of lines on here.
Is that the direction they took? Right.
Some of them did, yeah, some of them did. All right, so let's see how this goes. I've got a lot to cover here, and so I'm going to delve straight into the history of the game. This is the History Club after all. It's not really about me. The star of this show is this Gallipoli game, and I want to talk about the history of Gallipoli as we deliver it through the game. And if you play the game, hopefully you'll learn a lot. Okay, well the game is a war game for 2 players. One player plays the Turks, the other plays the Australians. It does take about 3 to 4 hours to play. As a historical simulation, a historical game, that's considered short. Some of these war games can take days. As a war game, it's considered easy to moderate complexity. But if you're more used to playing games like Cluedo and Risk and those types of things, it is more complicated. So if you want to try and play it, and you're used to Cluedo, it will be a bit more intricate than that. But as far as a war game is concerned, it's actually just moderate complexity. All right. So the game focuses on the Gallipoli campaign of 1915. One of the things I want to mention here is the game focuses on the Australian involvement at Gallipoli. It is not the British landings to the south and the French landings on the mainland. The French do publish this game. It's by a French company called Hexasim, and we were surprised to find the French were interested in Gallipoli. Why? Because they were there. They were on the mainland and the British were further south at a place called Cape Helles. But we don't delve into that. The main area that is interesting and exciting is basically what happened in the ANZAC theatre with the Australians and the New Zealanders. All right. Now, a lot of generals would emerge from this conflict that were quite important. The main one is Kemal Ataturk. Now, Ataturk would come into his own in this particular conflict, and he directed the Turkish forces, and later on he would become the president of Turkey, leading a new modern Turkey into history after the First World War. So this conflict is as important to the Turks as it is to the Australians. It really, it's the creation of a young country for Australia and New Zealand. It was the first time we were fighting under our own flag, but it is also forging a new Turkey. Now, there are three others you may or may not have heard of if you know your Australian military history. Leslie Morshead was there. Now, Morshead was a junior officer at the Battle of Lone Pine, which you may have heard of, I don't know. But Morshead would go on to hold off Rommel in the Second World War at Tobruk. And that's probably the most famous one of our Australian conflicts. It was Morshead who stopped Rommel, and that's quite important in the Second World War. Another one is Harry Chauvel. Now, Chauvel was commander of the 1st Light Horse Brigade, and he would go on in World War I to lead in the Middle East, and including the capture of Beersheba. Now, Beersheba in 1917 is the last great cavalry charge, well, successful cavalry charge, and that was done by Australians under Chauvel. And that military campaign of his is considered to be very successful, so there's that. And the third one is, of course, John Monash. You know Monash University. Monash would become Australia's most celebrated general, and you've all heard of the name, but you probably don't know some of his successes. He would, on the Western Front, have these great successes at the Battle of Hamel and Amiens, and he would lead the Western Allies with Australian soldiers to blow a hole in the German lines that Ludendorff called a black day in the German army. It really caused a collapse, and his successes in the West, on the Western Front later would become very significant. All right. Now, what is this map? What am I showing you here? It just sort of looks like a brown and blue blob. I need to zoom out a little bit and show you another image. Okay. So can you see that image there? The area portrayed in the map for the game covers one of the narrowest parts of the neck where the Dardanelles are up to Constantinople. You see Constantinople is up there in the top right, and the whole idea was to try to knock Turkey out of the war by landing troops on the peninsula so they could take out the forts guarding the Dardanelles and then march up to Constantinople and knock Turkey out. This landing, they landed them on the top left of that square, and they were going to try to go across to an area called Maltepe, the heights of this map. And from the heights you could see the forts on the opposite side protecting the Dardanelles. So the whole thing was about trying to knock out those forts. And you need to see, at least glance at this map to have any idea of the context of the map I'm going to delve into. Now the heights, what they call Chunuk Bair and Maltepe, provide an observation of both sides of the peninsula. And so whoever controlled those heights controlled the peninsula and would probably win. Where are we? Okay. So, this whole thing was the brainchild of Winston Churchill, who was the first Lord of the Admiralty of the British Navy. And Churchill had originally started gambling with the Navy's ships, trying to force the Dardanelles, and he thought he was more than happy to lose a dozen ships. But after they lost 3 ships, 3 sunk and 3 damaged, the Admiral came back to him and said, look, we don't want to lose any more ships, you've got to do something about this. You've got to bring in an amphibious landing and help take this by land, because we're not going to sacrifice any more of our precious ships to your little exploit to try to knock out Turkey. And it was because of this that the whole Gallipoli campaign was born. All right. Now, the first scenario in the game is called the ANZAC landing, which is about the landing of ANZAC troops. And if I go to a window here, I'll try to explain that to you quickly. So in this game, there's a rule book, and there is also a scenario book for the Australians, or the ANZACs, and another one for the Turks. And these books outline how to set up each of the scenarios. And so they tell you how to place the various counters representing the various sides on the map. All right. Now, as looking at that scenario, you can see ANZAC Cove here on the left, and you can see the little boats representing the ANZAC forces landing at ANZAC Cove. Now, as you all know, in school they all teach us that the British landed us too far north, and instead of landing at a nice beach, we were confronting these sheer cliffs. So if you see ANZAC Cove here, you'll see here there's Pluggy's Plateau, and this red line represents a cliff face called the Sphinx. So when the poor ANZACs landed, they were confronted by these sheer cliffs. And there is a picture here I can show you of the Sphinx. Here is Gallipoli's iconic Sphinx. That is the mountain that they landed directly underneath. Now this thing became very iconic, and also in the treacherous terrain around Gallipoli, it was a way of trying to work out where you were. If you could see the Sphinx, you could try to work your way back to the beach. But what they don't usually tell us is this may have been a saving grace for the Australians, because the actual beach they were meant to land on is this area here that you'll notice is called the Valley of Despair. Now there's a reason for that, and the reason is the Turks had been waiting for them and had set up a fort at Gallipoli with howitzers that were pointing at that beach. There were also pieces at Lone Pine, which you may have heard of, and they were also facing that beach, and had the Australians landed at what later became known as the Valley of Despair, it probably wouldn't have been a very good landing. Now, why did they want to land at the Valley of Despair? Well, it wasn't called that initially, but why do they want to land there? The idea, let's get the red brush here, I'm going to zoom out a bit more. The idea was for the forces to land at this beach here and traverse along this relatively flat area up to Maltepe here. Now, Maltepe was a height, and from Maltepe you could see both sides of the peninsula, and you could see the forts, and that was the basic British plan. Land there, the Turks will run away, we'll go straight through the peninsula, we'll get to Maltepe and take out those forts. That was the British plan. But the Turks clearly weren't going to let them do that nearly as easily as Churchill had hoped. One of the things I want to point out is the battlefield is actually quite small. It is only 9 kilometres from ANZAC Cove to Maltepe. That's not actually that far. But this terrain is very, very rugged and is very, very uneven. I have never been to Gallipoli, but Paul and other people here have, and they tell me it's quite an exhausting walk trying to do that walk, or even from ANZAC Cove up to the heights of Russell's Top. It's a very deceiving battlefield. The other things that are of some interest is the British fleet were meant to support the landing with bombardment. The ANZACs did not take any artillery. They didn't think they'd need it. They were hoping for the ship's guns to support their attack. If you zoom in here, you'll see some of these hills. One of them is called Battleship Hill. and the other is Destroyer Hill, wherever that is. Can't see it anymore. Battleship Hill, and Destroyer Hill is actually down here. That was the range of the guns of the destroyers and the battleships. That was how far they could shoot inland. So, an interesting little point. Okay, the boats were landed too far north under the Sphinx, which was probably a godsend. Okay, and the scale of the map for anybody who's interested is 1 centimetre is 100 metres. Now, some of these areas that were key to the conflict, such as the neck and the apex, which I will talk about. The neck is featured in the movie Gallipoli with Mel Gibson at the end, and also the apex. These areas are no bigger than just a few tennis courts. So the battlefield of Gallipoli was deceptively small. All right. Now, the Turks did not know for sure where the French, the British, and the Australians were going to land, and they had a sparse defence with most of their troops in reserve. And the idea is once they knew where they would land, they would then move the reserves to wherever that landing was. And the Australians, well, the New Zealanders all land too far north up along this beach. And Ataturk, at the time, was stationed over here in Bengali. And he realised immediately that the Australians would likely try to go up to these heights here. That's called Chunuk Bair, that area there. And again, from those heights, they could set up artillery and shoot down onto the battlefield. And he knew he had to get somebody up there as fast as possible to shore that up. And so on the night, on the first day, he went up there with the 57th to this hill up here and told the 57th that the Australians were coming up that hill. There was nobody else there, Hill 971. There was nobody else there. And he didn't order them to fight, he ordered them to die. He said, in the amount of time it takes you to defend these hills here, we'll be able to get more reinforcements and officers up here. And that's actually a very famous order in Gallipoli. And the 57th did come down this hill, and they did prevent the Australians from, they did shore up this right-hand side at Chunuk Bair and a bit lower, and prevent them from taking those heights on the first day. And it's probably one of the most important points in the whole conflict. Had Kemal not done that, the Australians would have gotten to Chunuk Bair, and the whole story would have been different on the first day. In doing so, though, the 57th lost about 60% of their people. And if you go to Gallipoli, there are memorials, great memorials to the 57th, to this great sacrifice they made to prevent the Australians from making it up onto the heights of Chunuk Bair. Here, I do not order you to attack, I order you to die. In the time which passes until we die, other troops and commanders can take our place. They lost more than half the men of the 57th, but they were successfully able to hold the right flank of the Turkish defences. All right. So things about South Australia and the waves of troops that were coming off those boats. The healthy farm boys and the Queenslanders, the South Australians and the Western Australians were in the first wave, coming off the first boats. And the more trained troops, the New South Welshmen and the New Zealanders, who were actually the best trained of the lot, were those better trained troops came later in the third and fourth waves. But the South Australians were in that first wave, and they were part of the 10th Battalion. 10th Battalion, South Australia. And that was led by a fellow called Stanley Weir. And he landed with a scout platoon and quickly pushed his men of the 9th Queenslanders and the South Australians to start climbing those cliffs. And Weir and his men got further inland on that first day than anybody else did. So where exactly did they get to? The South Australians landed about here, and they pushed through to Third Ridge, which is here, which is quite far inland. And they got further forward, the South Australians got further forward than anybody else would with the scouts. Now, with the 10th, there was a fellow by the name of Frank John Scott, who was actually a porter. He'd started off before the war as a porter at Gawler railway station before the war. Now, Frank Scott proved to be an exceptional commander, and we've got a picture of him here, if I can find it. What have we got here? Here we go. So that's a picture of Frank. So Frank and his mate, by the name of Arthur Blackburn, got the farthest forward on that first day of Gallipoli, and Frank is from Gawler. So that's sort of a bit of important part of Gawler history. Now, both of them, in fact, Frank and Arthur Blackburn, would serve in the Western Front as well, and Frank would take part leading, actually, a raid on Celtic Wood on the Western Front, and he would lead 84 men, again of the 10th Battalion, into Celtic Wood, and they got caught between a German and British artillery barrage, and 37 of them disappeared. They never came back, and nobody really knows what happens to them. That's one of the great mysteries, a great Australian military mystery, and you would expect to find pieces of them or remnants. The rumours that the Germans shot them all and dug a pit and threw them in the pit, but German reports say nothing at all. It's very difficult to tell what happened. People have researched and have come to the conclusion eventually that, well, they were caught between two barrages of German and British artillery and they just got blown to bits, but we don't really know. Now, Frank actually led that expedition, so that Celtic Wood expedition is sort of part of your history here too, because Frank was the fellow in command going into Celtic Wood. All right. Now, there was only really any movement on the first 4 days of Gallipoli, and those scouting parties were fairly quickly pushed back. The Turks got their reinforcements, so Kamal got to the top of Hill 971. He pushed the Australians coming up the hill back down to this area here, Russell's Top and Quinn's Post, and the Turkish reinforcements did arrive, and they set up headquarters on Third Ridge, which was about where Frank got them. From Scrubby Knoll, Hobbs Hill and Third Ridge is where the Turks set up headquarters. They would pen the ANZACs into this area around ANZAC Cove, and they held on precariously to these heights at Quinn's Post and Russell's Top, just behind the Sphinx. But in these other areas further forward, the Chessboard, Baby 700, Battleship Hill, Chunning Bear, all of this was still held by the Turks, and the whole area very rapidly became a maze of trenches. And so you find that the Australians were penned in at ANZAC Cove into this tight area around here. So you see Shrapnel Gully, through Lone Pine. Lone Pine changed hands many times. They held on to Quinn's Post, which was an outcrop on the side of this cliff, Russell's Top, Walker's Ridge. The rest, the Turks hemmed them all in. And that was the first 5 days of the Gallipoli landing. The British fleet, which were helping with they were hoping the British fleet would be able to act like artillery, but the trajectory of the ship's guns generally is flat, and they found that it was not effective in blowing dug-in Turks out of their trenches. The ship's guns, they can do plunging fire, but it was very difficult. And so the ships weren't nearly as effective as the British Navy had hoped. There is one little thing here that's worth mentioning. Go back to our few images here. The AE2, that's the AE2, Australian submarine. On that first day, on the 25th of April, that submarine, Australian submarine, snuck through the Dardanelles and started disturbing their shipping and torpedoed a Turkish boat. And so this is the very beginnings of submarines. And the Australians were right there, right at the beginning. So if you wonder why we have this history of conventional submarines and nuclear submarines, Australia actually has a history of using these things. And this was a great morale booster for the ANZACs on that first day. So the AE2 is an interesting little bit of our history, and that was then. Now the trouble is, though, of course, the Germans also had U-boats, and the British Navy got scared. They didn't want their flagship, the Queen Elizabeth, to be sunk by a sitting duck, just a target sitting at Anzac Cove. And after those 5 days, the British fleet left. And so it was very much thinned down. All right. The second scenario in this particular game is the Turkish counterattack, which was also very interesting. The Turks figured that the Anzacs were hemmed in this little area, and they decided to do a bayonet charge at night and just sweep them back into the ocean. And they outnumbered them 3-1. You've got over 40,000 Turkish troops, about 42,000 Turkish troops, launched a massive counterattack against about 17,000 Australians. And it was done at night, and the hope was that it would be a surprise and they'd push them back into the ocean. But the Australians were watching, and they basically knew what was happening. There was no element of surprise. When the Turks attacked, the Australians were sitting on the parapet of their trenches shooting at the Turks, coming at them with bayonets, and it was dreadful. The Ottomans suffered over 10,000 casualties, including more than 3,000 dead, which were the heaviest losses of the entire campaign. And during that period, Albert Jacka, who was featured on the cover of the box, won the first Victoria Cross of World War I. He was at Quinn's Post. He was up in that little post up here, and he retook a trench against 7 other Turks who'd come into the trench. Anyway, the aftermath was so horrific that all these Turkish bodies were left in no man's land, and flies swarmed into the whole area, and that contaminated everything, contaminated the food, contaminated the water. Everybody naturally ended up eating flies because it got into the food, and then if you do that, you get dysentery, and it was absolutely unbearable. It was so bad that a truce was arranged. They basically, both sides said, "You've got to clean this up." And they said, "All right." And they let the Turks come in and clean up all their dead. On the 24th of May, there was this truce. And what's interesting is there was a mutual respect that occurred at Gallipoli after that truce. So the notion of Gallipoli, where there was this respect between both sides that carried on through the Gallipoli campaign. Before that point, each side was a faceless enemy. They hated each other. But after they actually met each other and swapped cigarettes and rations and helped bury all these dead, the notion of the conflict changed considerably. All right. So, the ANZACs were penned in here for the next 4 months. And there was this big question of what to do. Do they pull them out? Do they push forward? They have a foothold. There has been some success with the ANZACs at ANZAC Cove. And there was a decision was made to have another offensive in August. They call this the August Offensive. And the New Zealanders were by far the best trained of the troops. There's a reason why New Zealand finds ANZAC very important. And the New Zealanders and the Gurkhas, who were also exceptionally well trained, were sent in to try to take these heights at Chalik Bear, which we talked about earlier. This is what was at risk on the first day. And they said, go in with the Gurkhas and the New Zealanders and take those heights. We're going to try one more time. All right. So the New Zealanders started up here on Ocean Beach and they swept along this ridge. There's my drawing thing here. From Ocean Beach they came up Bukop's Hill, where Bukop died, which is why it's called Bukop Hill. Along here, up Rhododendron Ridge, and up this little shallow point called the Apex. And at the Apex, they had this great commander, William Malone, who was commander of the Wellington Battalion. And he famously refused to attack up the Apex during the day, saying it was suicidal. But at night, he did a sudden charge, and the New Zealanders got to Chunk Bear and held onto this area here for 2 days. And if you talk to the New Zealanders about the Gallipoli campaign, they call it the Battle of Sari Bar, because it's Sari Bar Ridge. This was the great New Zealand participation in the conflict, and this is what they remember about it. They got there and they held that ridge for 2 days. The Gurkhas came in under another fellow by the name of Allinson, and the Gurkhas were ordered to come up through this way to take Hill Q, which this was very treacherous, and the Gurkhas were in this very risky position to do it, and they didn't succeed, but their presence there helped the New Zealanders take Chalik Bear. And if it wasn't for the Gurkhas being there trying to take Hill Q, the New Zealanders probably wouldn't have gotten up to Chunk Bear. Now, our famous General Monash was also meant to be there. Monash was meant to attack Hill 971, this guy here. And Gallipoli is not really a high point for Monash. Monash became completely lost. And at night, they wandered far northwest. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not a large battlefield. And Monash somehow wandered northwest at night and ended up all the way up here off the map.
Good idea.
Yeah. So how he managed to get that far north is a bit of a mystery. But it is sort of indicate how treacherous the whole terrain is, and anybody who's been there can say it's a very difficult area to walk around. Now, the New Zealanders were on these heights for 2 days, but it was a very rocky area that was difficult to defend. The historian Charles Bean, who was there, describes the position as so rocky that effective trenches could not be dug, nor proper fields of fire for machine guns. And Kemal ordered another bayonet charge after 2 days, and this time the bayonet charge worked perfectly. And the Turks came in and they swept them clean off Charlie Bear, clean off the hill. And some of them actually fell down onto this area called the farm below. So the New Zealanders were basically pushed clean off the hill. All right. So the whole August offensive was about taking those heights. At the same time, slightly beforehand, the Australians generally were asked to make a diversion. So if you've seen the movie Gallipoli, they talk about this. And it was, the military said, this is not a real assault, this is a diversion. And the diversion they devised was Lone Pine. And also the fateful charge at the neck, which is what you see at the end of the movie Gallipoli. But the planners of Lone Pine did a very good job. And rather than charging across no man's land, they did extensive tunnelling and sapping. So they dug tunnels underneath so that they didn't have to cover all that no man's land at Lone Pine to get to the Turkish trenches. They had very light losses across open ground, and they actually took the trench in the first 20 minutes. But then this was a very extensive network of well-defended Turkish trenches, and this turned into ferocious hand-to-hand fighting over 4 days. Now, this particular battle, the Australians were awarded 7 Victoria's Crosses in this Battle of Lone Pine, which is more than the Australians have ever received since. So when you say Lone Pine, military historians and Australians like to talk about this conflict. And our General Leslie Morshead was there. And there's this interesting picture of him. This is a very famous photo of Morshead at Lone Pine. That's Morshead here, and he's looking up at the trench to the dead and the parapet around the trench at Lone Pine. Now Morshead, as I mentioned earlier, would go on to lead the Australians against Rommel in World War II. The first time the Germans were defeated on land in World War II was achieved by this fellow here in Australia. But that was Lone Pine. Now that was meant to be a feint. So it's like, oh, well, you Australians did quite well there. The next day, the New Zealand General Godley ordered the Australian light horse to attack at this little area called the Neck. And the light horsemen were mowed down not more than 10 paces from the trench, as you see in the movie Gallipoli. So that is basically the problem with the Neck. Here we go. The light horse, 150 men in each wave, many of whom were killed or wounded within 10 paces of that trench. It's been called one of the bravest actions in the history of war, and yet it may have impeded the Turks for a few hours, but as a diversion it didn't really stop the Turks from coming back up here to worry about the Gurkhas and the New Zealanders trying to take the heights, which is really what it was about. As mentioned in the movie, the British also landed further north, up at Suvla Bay, and the British were meant to come off the boats and go straight up into the high grounds. And the British general was inexperienced, and he didn't order the troops to move once they got off the boats, and they were effectively sitting around at Suvla Bay drinking tea, and they lost their opportunity, and the Turks came in and took the heights, and it was another disaster. So that's Lone Pine for you. So other little things here I'd like to just generally talk about. Murdoch, Keith Murdoch, Rupert Murdoch's father. He arrived at Gallipoli at around the time of just soon after the August offensive, and there was this question of now what do we do? We're still stuck here with no further inland. And Murdoch wrote this letter to the Australian Prime Minister at the time, Andrew Fisher, and it was the Gallipoli letter, which you can read about in depth here, that was circulated through circles in London amongst political leaders and officials in London, and it was Murdoch's letter that really indicated to the British that it was time for them to withdraw from Gallipoli. So that's worth mentioning. Hamilton, who was the overall commander at Gallipoli as a whole, both the whole British landing in the north and at Suvla Bay in the south at Cape Helles, he's largely held responsible for the failures of the campaign. He had a great reluctance to sack underperforming generals underneath him. So if you look at this Cape Helles in the south, which I had mentioned, there was this fellow Hunter Weston who ordered repeated attacks against the well-defended Turks and lost many, many horrendous casualties for the British and the Irish. He killed a lot of Irish. And Hunter Weston was sort of a murderer down in Suvla Bay. The whole thing was so embarrassing to the British they don't want to talk about it at all. That's Cape Helles, I'm sorry. At Suvla Bay in the north, our general up there was a fellow called Stopford. And Stopford was the next in line by seniority to be the general. And Kitchener refused to break protocol. Now, Stopford was old, he was inactive, he had never commanded troops before, but he was next in line to command the troops. And under the old British system, you don't break that. And Kitchener said, no, you have to have Stopford. And Stopford was a disaster. He never got off the boat. And the troops, when they landed at Suvla Bay, just sat around drinking tea. They weren't ordered to go up and try and take the Huns. When Billy Hughes becomes the Australian Prime Minister in October, he felt very strongly that the Australian troops should be commanded by their own officers. And this becomes very clear because you're basically seeing the Australian troops abused. The British just saw them as colonials and were, in some cases, throwing their lives away. Also on the Western Front at Passchendaele, which is where your fellow Frank was fighting, and that raid into Celtic Wood at Passchendaele was an example of the British basically just sending the colonials to their deaths. And Billy Hughes turns around and says, no, we want our own officers commanding our own men. And it's due to that Monash would eventually command the Australian Corps in 1918 and lead them on to these very decisive victories on the Western Front, where at Amiens he would, with the Australians, blow a hole through the German lines for this decisive victory. And after that battle, King George V crossed the English Channel and knighted Monash on the battlefield. So that all of that had a resounding effect. The Gallipoli letter, the British being told they can't command our troops, to Monash becoming much more prominent. The higher up he got, the more effective he got. He was a good organiser. And you do finally see a conclusion to World War I. And so I hope that gives you an insight into how Gallipoli ties into our history. As you've got ANZAC Day coming up on the 25th, and if you play the game a little bit, you really get a feel for the battlefield, the commanders, who was doing what and where and why, and where they were trying to fight and where the Turks stopped them. There you go.
Do we have any questions for Russell? Yes, Paul?
It's funny you mention the Gurkhas because you never hear about them do you? That's all. It's like they weren't there.
Yeah, no, the Gurkhas, no, they were pivotal in helping the New Zealanders take China back. There's a lot of criticism of Australia when we talk about Gallipoli, and that we talk like we own Gallipoli. Of course, the New Zealanders were definitely there, but the French were there too, and the Gurkhas were there as well. The British don't want to talk about it, but it's interesting when you look at it from a French perspective, because the French are printing our game. The French say, well, we were at Gallipoli on the mainland. So it was not just an ANZAC endeavour. It was quite something else. Also, I think I missed saying that Gallipoli landing was the largest amphibious landing up until D-Day. So it was quite an endeavour. It was no small thing. Any other questions?
Yes. Oh, we have one. Margaret?
Yeah.
Where do you buy it?
I have 6 copies here, so I can actually sell you a copy, $160 a copy, which is about right for a small print historical war game. If you don't want to get it from me here, you can buy it from Tabletop Warfare in Gawler. They've been very helpful selling copies. They've sold 19 copies, which is not bad for a one store. And I'm doing a How to Play on April the 13th to show people how to actually play the game at the store, and one again on the 25th, on ANZAC Day. The store has got copies, you can buy it directly from the store, 160. I have a few copies here, if anybody's interested I can sell them to you direct here, but I'd actually prefer to sell them through the store. But if you want to pick up a copy, I can do that for you as well.
A question? What did happen? Do you know any more of the history on that submarine that you were talking about?
Yeah, my understanding is it did get caught in the Bay of Murmur, and the Turks chased it and they ran it aground. They blew it up, and then the crew surrendered to the Turks.
In this skirmish?
Yes, so it was a few days later in the Sea of Murmur. If my understanding vaguely, let's see if I can find this again. All history talk. Let's go to the first red box map here. See there the Sea of Murmur before you get to Constantinople. The Turkish torpedo boats found it, chased it down, and they ran it aground, blew it up, and then they surrendered to the Turks. Yeah.
So South Australia has a very strong element now that we have the submarine corps.
Well, yeah, we have this history of submarines that you wouldn't expect. Yeah.
Where do those names come from in regards to the chessboard, Queens? How come there was chess type naming at some of those places?
So most of the names that we chose to use on the map for the game are legacies of the ANZAC presence at Gallipoli. The chessboard was called a chessboard because it was a crisscross mainly of Turkish trenches. So that was a labyrinth of maze of those trenches, which is why it was called a chessboard.
So they did actually play chess?
No. And it looked like a chessboard because from above you'd see these crossing trenches supporting each other.
Any other questions? Yes, Mark.
Russell, could you give us an indication of how long it took to research and develop that game from concept to it first being sold?
About 6 years. So I'm not the content specialist. My history is programming games, and my main focus was to get the mechanics of the game to work, to get the gears and levers to run smoothly. But the fellow who's the content expert, knowledgeable on the subject, is Kieran, and he started a Kickstarter on this about 8 years ago, and that was the beginning of it. And he picked that up a few years later, and that was with me when I was there, and that was about 6 years ago. So none of this is done overnight, and it's all difficult work and testing and refining and researching and trying to make it realistic and refining and rinse and repeat as you go. Nothing quick about it at all. Everyone thinks it'll be a year or two, or can you write a game? We'll write that in 6 months. To write a game takes a year and a half, at best 3 years, and to do something effective and good, more like 4 or 5.
We have a question down here.
I might mention that when Russell was in high school, he seemed to be spending all his time playing computer games. And I, as his father, said, Russ, you know, you should spend some time doing homework.
No.
And Russell replied, said, oh, Dad, I'm not playing a game, I'm making one up. And I said, oh, well, that's all right. And he actually, with another colleague, produced a game while he was in high school and sold it over the internet to some gaming company in San Francisco for a small amount of money.
Wow. We could buy it here in Australia.
The same game is still available?
Yeah.
Well, no, this is 1991. A friend of mine, we wrote a game for Macintosh computers to see how I use a Macintosh. But at the time, all the gaming industry was Windows computers. And they said, we'll sell you a game, but we need a Windows version. And we couldn't give them a Windows version because we used it for Macintosh. But eventually, we sold a few copies, and then we gave it away for free as shareware. And it became well known in the Macintosh environment because the Macintosh people didn't have very many games. But that was 1991. You can get Macintosh emulators that will still run that particular game. It's called Galactic Frontiers. And it was well known within the Macintosh enthusiast environment. So if there's anyone here who used to love Macintosh computers back in the 80s and early 90s, it was one of the few games that you could play because there weren't that many. Yeah.
One more question. What's next after you've done...
Chess.
What,
Yes.
Yeah, have you got anything on the horizon?
Yes, the sequel to Gallipoli is going to be another board game called Assault on Kokoda, where we're focusing on the Kokoda Trail and the Japanese coming to take Port Moresby, and is much, well, it's also very important for Australia because we defended Australia from the Japanese, and that is very important. In the background, I've also got a project on the history of chess, the origin of chess, and that's more of a much broader audience for schools, and that just looks at the history of chess. It was originated in India, it went to Persia, it was spread by Islam, it arrives in Spain, the Europeans pick it up, but it also goes eastward. The Thais have their own version of chess called Makruk, the Japanese have their version of chess called Shogi, and the Chinese play a version of chess called Zhangxi. And just by sheer weight of numbers, Zhangxi is probably the most popular board game in the world that you wouldn't know because you're not in China. But that's the history of chess is also fascinating, and that's another project which got interrupted by Gallipoli, I may add. And now that Gallipoli's finished, I can now go back to it and try and finish it. But the short answer is we're doing Assault on Kokoda. We're trying to do the Kokoda Trail.
How soon?
Oh, it'll be at least another 3 years. Yeah.
You just told us before.
No rush.
A minimum of a year and a half. Maybe we can do this one a bit quicker.
Well, thank you very much. And on behalf of the history team and our guests, we'd like to present you with a small token of appreciation.
Oh, wonderful.
Thank you very much. So,